In 1985, 17-year-old Michelle Avila, who just went by the nickname Missy, was a high school junior living in the working-class town of Arleta, California, which is located just north of Los Angeles, California. Despite Missy being very physically small, she was under 5 feet tall and barely weighed 95 pounds, she had a big presence about her, and it made her very popular at her school. Not only was she incredibly beautiful, with boys and girls falling over themselves to try to win her affection, but also Missy was just very kind and gentle and didn't seem to take herself very seriously. But life for Missy was not all perfect. A year earlier, during her sophomore year, a nasty rumor had been spread around Missy's high school that Missy had apparently been sleeping with all of these boys who were in established relationships with girls in the school, and even though this rumor was a total lie, by the time the rumor reached the girlfriends of these boys that Missy had apparently slept with, these girls believed it. And so to get their revenge on Missy, one day after school when she had walked outside, this group of girls ganged up on her and beat her really, really badly. In fact, the beating was so severe that when Missy came home, her family immediately pressed charges on the girl that seemed to kind of lead the attack. Her name was Sonia Bon. But despite Missy and her family immediately filing these charges, the case dragged for months and months and months. But finally, by October 1st, 1985, so at the beginning of Missy's junior year, Missy was within a week of actually going to court and taking the stand and testifying against Sonia. And while Missy was certainly nervous about going to court and testifying, she knew deep down she was making the right decision. On October 1st, so a week before Missy is set to testify, Missy came home from school and she told her mom that she had plans that afternoon to go hang out with her friends. This was fairly routine for Missy, who had a big circle of friends, and so her mother, Irene, told her that was totally fine, but you gotta be home by 6 p.m. Missy agreed, and then just a couple of minutes later, a 17-year-old girl named Laura Doyle, who was very close with Missy, she pulled up outside of Missy's house and she honked the horn. And so Missy heard her, she said goodbye to her mom and to her brother, and then she left the house, ran to Laura's car, hopped inside, and the two girls drove off. A few hours later, at 6 p.m., Missy had still not come home yet. However, her mother, Irene, was not that surprised. Missy was not really a troublemaker, but she really liked staying out with her friends, and so it wasn't that uncommon for her to stay out past curfew and then come home and ask for forgiveness, or she would stay out past curfew and then she would call her mother and ask for more time. And shortly after 6 p.m., the phone rang inside of Missy's house. And so Irene, she hears the phone ringing and she's expecting it to be her daughter. And so she walks over, she picks the phone up and says, "Hello?" But it's not her daughter. It's another young girl's voice. It's Laura's voice, the girl who had picked Missy up after school to go hang out with friends. And before Irene could ask Laura why she was calling, Laura kind of awkwardly asked Irene, "Hey, is Missy home?" And Irene would say, "Laura, she left with you. Isn't she with you?" "No, she's not here. She's running late. Why? What's going on?" After Irene said this, Laura began to panic, and then she proceeded to tell Irene what happened that afternoon while she was out with her daughter. She said after she picked Missy up, the two of them just kind of drove around town, which they did all the time, and then at some point they made their way over to Stonehurst Park, where Missy and Laura and a bunch of their friends would often go and hang out. And so they drove over to Stonehurst, they made their way into the parking lot, and as soon as they were in there, Laura began looking around for other cars that she recognized to see if maybe their friends were there. But after looking around, she didn't recognize any of the cars, and so Laura just reflexively began turning the car around to leave the park. But as she was doing that, Missy stopped her and said, "Wait a minute, I know the guys over there, I want to go say hi." And so Laura stopped the car and she looked in the direction that Missy was pointing, and on the far side of the parking lot were these two guys who appeared to be maybe in their late teens, early 20s. Laura did not recognize either of them, and they were standing outside of this blue car, a blue Camaro. Now, Laura was accustomed to Missy just kind of knowing everybody in town because everybody loved Missy and Missy loved everyone. And so this type of situation was not totally uncommon. However, Laura was just not very excited at the prospect of going and hanging out with these two total strangers to her. but she could tell Missy really wanted to, and so she turns to Missy and says, okay, go out there, go say hi to them, and I'm gonna park and I'll meet you in a second. And so Missy, she hops out of the car and she begins walking over to these two guys and she's waving to them and they're waving back and smiling at her. And Laura, meanwhile, pulls the car into a parking spot, she throws it in park, and she's about to get out when she notices her gas gauge is below empty. And so she calls out to Missy, who's now halfway to these two guys, and she says, hey, I'm gonna go fill my car up with gas and then I'll come back and I'll meet you. And so Missy turns around and she's like, okay, bye. And so Laura puts her car back in drive and she pulls out of the lot and she heads into town to get some gas. A few minutes later, when Laura pulled back into the Stonehurst parking lot, she looked in the direction of where the blue Camaro and the two guys were and where Missy was headed, and they're all gone. Missy is nowhere to be seen. Now, this was 1985, so Laura could not just call or text Missy to see where she had gone, and so instead, Laura just sat in the parking lot looking at the vacant spot where the blue car had been, kind of going over in her mind what she should do. And eventually, she told herself that, you know what, Missy was a big girl, she can handle herself, she knew those guys, I'm sure everything is just fine, and those guys will drop her off at her house when she needs to go home. And so even though Laura is telling herself this, she would leave the Stonehurst parking lot and spend a while just kind of driving around town looking for Missy and looking for this blue Camaro and these two guys, and after finding none of them, she would head home. And then, right after 6 p.m., Laura picked up the phone and she called Missy's house because she knew Missy's curfew was 6 p.m., and so she should be home by now. But of course, when Missy's mother, Irene, picked up the phone, Laura would learn Missy had not come home. And so Irene and Laura are immediately really worried about Missy, but not to the point where either of them think they should involve the police. Instead, Laura and Irene would spend the next couple of hours after that 6 p.m. phone call calling everybody they could think of that might know where Missy was. And when that yielded no results, Laura and Irene actually met up that night and began going door to door to all of Missy's friends and acquaintances' houses, asking the occupants if they knew where Missy was. But by late that night, no one had given them any information about Missy's whereabouts, and so still feeling very concerned about Missy, Laura and Irene decided the best thing to do was just to go back home and go to bed and hope in the morning Missy turned up or someone contacted them with information about where Missy was. But the following morning, Missy had still not turned up and no one had heard from her, and so that morning Irene went to the police and told them what was going on. Immediately, the police honed in on Laura and began going over every single detail of what that blue Camaro was doing, what those two guys looked like, what did Missy say about these two guys? Did she get any information about where they might go or who these guys were? And Laura, she was totally guilt-ridden and emotional about being the last person to see Missy before she has apparently vanished. And she sat there trying to give every bit of information she possibly could about what had happened that day. But unfortunately, she was just too far away from these two guys and their vehicle. She could only give them a sort of basic physical description, which Laura even admitted was not very accurate because it was really far away, and frankly, she wasn't looking that hard. And so after getting all the information they possibly could from both Laura and Irene, the police launched a very extensive search all over Arleta, California, and the surrounding areas. And while they were doing that, Irene and other members of Missy's family, along with Laura and other close friends of Missy's, began their own search. But after a couple of days, neither the professional search nor the amateur search had turned up any new information about Missy's whereabouts or the whereabouts of those two guys and their blue Camaro. But then on October 4th, just 3 days after Missy went missing, Missy would be found. However, it would take investigators another 3 years to finally make sense of what actually happened to her. Based on eyewitness testimony, here is a recreation of what happened to Missy on the day she vanished. On that day, which was Tuesday, October 1st, 1985, Missy came back from school. She told her mother she wanted to go out and hang out with her friends. Her mother told her, okay, be home by 6. And then a couple of minutes later, Laura pulled up outside and honked the horn, and Missy ran outside, hopped in the car, and they drove off. The pair would drive around town for a few minutes before making their way to Stonehurst Park. Now, to understand what happens next, you need some context. Missy had two best friends. One of them was 17-year-old Laura Doyle, who she was with, and the other was another 17-year-old girl named Karen Severson. These three girls had met when they were in grade school, they lived basically on the same street, and they spent virtually every second of every day together. However, a month earlier in September, the trio had had a falling out because a month earlier, another rumor about Missy sleeping with boys who had girlfriends began circulating around the school, except this time the girlfriends in the rumor were Laura and Karen. Now, of course, Laura and Karen were well aware of the fact that a year earlier, Missy had been accused of something similar, and it had all been a big lie. And so going into this new rumor, Laura and Karen knew that the likelihood of it being real was very slim, but because this rumor directly involved them and their boyfriends, they felt a little concerned. And so Laura and Karen went to Missy and they said, "Hey, we don't think it's true, but is it true? Did you sleep with our boyfriends?" And Missy immediately is like, "Are you kidding me? No, I didn't sleep with your boyfriends. Did you see what happened last year? It's the same thing. It's a lie. It's just a rumor. I can't believe you would think I would do that to you." And so pretty quickly, this discussion escalated to a full-blown fight between the girls. Or more specifically, it turned into a full-blown fight between Karen and Missy. Because Laura, she was worked up about it, but pretty quickly she was able to calm down. But Karen, she didn't calm down. Because apparently Karen had seen Missy at some point flirting with her boyfriend, and so when this rumor began to circulate, Karen felt like, you know what? It could be true. She might have had sex with my boyfriend. And so eventually, the three girls just stopped fighting. Not because they had reached some sort of compromise, but rather because Missy just tried to turn around and walk away. And when she did, Karen wound up and slapped her across the face. And as soon as that happened, all three girls knew a line had been crossed, and now their decade-long friendship was potentially ruined. Over the next couple of weeks, Missy and Laura were able to come together and patch things up, but Missy and Karen continued to avoid each other. However, the distance between them really wore on both of them, and so finally, on the morning of October 1st, Karen would reach out to Missy and she would apologize. And Missy was really touched by this, and before long, Missy and Karen and Laura had made plans for that afternoon to meet up at Stonehurst Park to have a good day together, just like old times. So that afternoon, Laura picks up Missy from her house, and the two of them drive around for a bit before heading over to Stonehurst Park, where they're planning to meet Karen. But when Laura pulls the car into the parking lot, they look around and Karen is not there. And the blue Camaro and those two guys standing around it on the far side of the parking lot, they weren't there either. Because Laura had made up the blue Camaro and those two guys. They never existed. That was all just a big cover-up for what happens next. A few years ago, I was told that my anger issues were actually tied to something much bigger. I was depressed. But despite agreeing with this conclusion, it was still really difficult for me to go out and get help. I just felt really uncomfortable at the notion of walking into some doctor's office and telling some stranger about my feelings that I didn't even understand. But with the encouragement of my family and friends, I did seek out a therapist, and honestly, it saved my life. So if you have a lot on your mind right now, but you've put it off because it's too uncomfortable to go out and get help, then today's video sponsor, BetterHelp, is for you. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you don't ever have to walk into the doctor's office and have some super intense in-person conversation about your feelings. Instead, you can get the help you need from the comfort of your own home. On BetterHelp, all 20,000 plus therapists, without exception, are licensed, trained, experienced, and accredited psychologists, marriage and family therapists, clinical social workers, or licensed professional counselors. They also all have a master's degree or doctorate degree in their field, and they possess at least 3 years and 1,000 hours of hands-on experience. Therapy really does work, and BetterHelp is the most accessible, affordable, and convenient therapy option out there. Visit betterhelp.com/MrBallen. That's BetterHelp, and join the over 2 million people who are taking charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. Special offer for you: get 10% off your first month when you go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen. So Laura and Missy, they pull into the parking lot at Stonehurst, and they park in a spot and proceed to wait for Karen. And Karen would show up just a couple of minutes later. But when she showed up, all hell broke loose. Karen came flying into the parking lot and came to a screeching stop right up alongside Laura's car. Karen had parked her car so close to Laura's car that Laura literally couldn't open her door without striking Karen's car. And in Karen's car, in the passenger seat, which was closest to Laura's car, was a terrified-looking 17-year-old named Eva Cherambolo, who was friends with all three of the girls, and that day, Karen had apparently asked Eva to come over for dinner, but after picking Eva up, without giving her any explanation, she had flown over to Stonehurst and then came to this screeching stop right next to Laura's car. And so Eva is sitting in the passenger seat looking at Karen and looking over at Laura and Missy, having no idea what's going on, and Karen begins yelling at Eva to roll her window down. And so Eva rolls her window down, and Laura and Missy are looking over in absolute astonishment. And then once the window is down on Eva's side, Karen begins screaming across Eva out the window at the car that Laura and Missy are in. And so Laura and Missy exchange totally confused looks, and then Laura rolls her window down, and suddenly Laura and Missy can hear what Karen is yelling. And Karen is hurling the most vile and horrible insults at Laura, not at Missy. It takes Laura a second to realize what Karen is yelling about, but once she realizes that Karen is just ruthlessly insulting her, Laura just turns and begins hurling insults back at Karen. And so the whole time, Laura and Karen are just screaming at each other. Missy and Eva are just sitting in their respective passenger seats, having no clue what's going on. And just as quickly as Karen had arrived and begun screaming at Laura, Karen put her car back in drive and sped right out of the parking lot. And Laura at this point is totally incensed and enraged at Karen for some of the things she had said. And so Laura fired up her car, threw it in drive, and before Missy could tell her otherwise, Laura had sped out of the parking lot after Karen. And for the next 45 minutes, Karen and Laura drove like absolute maniacs north of the city up into the mountains, where the whole time they're driving, Karen is swerving side to side, and she's speeding along these desolate roads, and Laura would speed up and get right on her bumper, like she was experiencing this extreme case of road rage. Now, for the first few minutes of this, both Missy and Eva were desperately trying to get their drivers to calm down and just pull over. Whatever you're fighting about, it's not worth crashing and dying over. But little did Missy or Eva know, there was something much, much bigger going on between Laura and Karen. And so their requests to stop the cars fell on deaf ears. Finally, after this 45-minute white-knuckle insane drive along these mountain roads came to an end when the road they were on kind of funneled them into this dirt parking lot in the middle of this huge forest. And as soon as they reached this parking lot, Karen came to a stop, and Laura narrowly avoided smashing into her and came to a stop right next to her. And as soon as the two cars were stopped, both drivers hopped out and were immediately in each other's faces, shoving each other, screaming at each other, just continuing this awful fight. Eva just stayed in the passenger seat and did nothing. She was just hoping that whatever was going on would eventually end and they could leave. But Missy, she's looking out there at her two best friends who seem like they're about to kill each other. And so Missy decides she's going to get out and try to separate them. And so she begins to open her car door, and the second she does, both Karen and Laura, who were maybe 5 or 6 feet away from her car door, they both immediately stop fighting. It was like a switch had been thrown, and whatever was going on had come to a complete and total stop. And at the same time they have suddenly stopped fighting, both girls simultaneously turn and look at Missy. And before Missy could say or do anything, Karen and Laura ran over and positioned themselves right outside of Missy's door. So Missy could no longer shut the door, and Missy could not get out of the car. She was totally trapped. And as soon as Karen was in position right outside of the car, Karen kind of got down and got right in Missy's face, and with a very menacing and hissing voice, she looks at Missy and says, "You know, this whole thing was a joke. Me and Laura, we weren't actually fighting. We're not mad at each other, but we are mad at someone. We're mad at you." And then Karen and Laura would reach down and pull Missy out of the car, and they would slam her back up against the side of Laura's car. And then Laura and Karen pressed up against her and began screaming at Missy that she had slept with their boyfriends, and they knew it. And this whole time, Missy is trying to tell them, no, I did not sleep with your boyfriends. I don't know what's going on. But at some point, Karen and Laura were screaming so loudly, and they were right on top of her, that Missy just kind of began to shut down, and she went quiet and kind of tucked herself into a ball. And as soon as this happened, Karen and Laura, they grabbed Missy and they began pushing her away from the car towards a trail that led into the forest. And Missy, she's 4'10", 95 pounds. She's tiny. And Karen was 5'2", over 200 pounds, and Laura was 5'6" tall and weighed 135 pounds. And so Missy knew she could not put up a fight. She had no chance against these two. And so Missy just kind of began shuffling her feet, walking towards this trail, and periodically Karen and Laura would walk up and push her to walk towards this trail. And as this is happening, Eva, who had been sitting in the car the whole time, she finally got out and kind of walked up behind the group, but didn't participate. She just walked along behind them. And so after a couple of minutes, Karen and Laura had managed to push Missy all the way to the actual start of the trail, this narrow trail that left the parking lot. And at that point, Laura walked around Missy, so she was in front of her, and Karen stayed behind Missy. And the two girls ordered Missy to keep following them into the woods. And Missy did not put up a fight. She just put her head down and continued walking along the trail behind Laura, with Karen behind her, periodically pushing her, and then several steps behind Karen was Eva, who just continued to do nothing. After the girls had walked for a little while on this trail and were out of sight of the parking lot, Laura came to an abrupt stop and she turned around to face Missy. And by this point, Missy was genuinely terrified. She was crying, she had her head down, and she was just hoping that her captors were going to let her go. But once they stopped and Missy looked up at Laura, Laura wound up and decked Missy right in the face. And as soon as she hit Missy, Karen immediately jumped in. And before long, Missy was on the ground getting punched and kicked and stomped on by Laura and Karen. And again, Eva just stood there watching, doing nothing. Eventually, Laura and Karen would stop beating Missy. And at that point, Laura would pull out a knife and she would reach down and she would grab Missy's hair and she began hacking it off. Missy was not a vain person, but she loved her hair. It had to be perfect anywhere she went. It was her prized possession, and Laura and Karen knew it. And so Laura, she begins hacking off the hair with her knife, and Karen, who wanted to get involved but didn't have a knife, just began grabbing Missy's hair and ripping it out with her fists. Finally, after much of Missy's hair had been hacked off of her head, Laura and Karen stopped and just stood up and looked down at Missy, who was now in the fetal position just crying to herself. But Laura and Karen were not done. At this point, they got out restraints and they tied Missy's hands behind her back and they gagged her mouth. And again, Eva did nothing. Once Missy was completely restrained, Laura got up and began walking towards a nearby stream that was about 10 feet away from them down a hill. And so Laura gets down to the stream, she wades in about halfway where the water comes up about 8 inches on her leg, and then she turns around and she looks up the hill at Missy and Karen and Eva, who's off to the side. And Laura, while staring directly at Missy, she reaches down and begins running her fingers through the water and says to Missy, "Why don't you come down and get in the water with me?" When Missy didn't move, Karen, who was standing next to her, hauled her up and then pushed her down the hill. And Missy doesn't have the ability to brace her fall because her hands are bound, and so she slams down on her face and she rolls down to the edge of the water, and there she stops. And before Missy can get up, Karen and Laura had descended on her, they had grabbed her by the shoulders, and they began dragging her out into the water. And so Eva, who's watching this happen, again does nothing and just turns around and begins running down the trail back towards the cars. When she gets to the cars, she discovers they are both locked, so she can't go anywhere, and she was too far away from anywhere to walk, and so her only choice was just to go back down the trail to where her friends were. And so Eva goes back to this trail and she begins walking in the direction direction of the stream, and as she's walking, before she can see any of the girls, she hears a terrifying, blood-curdling scream coming from somewhere deep in the forest. And Eva was so terrified that she stopped where she was, she turned around, and she ran back to the cars. Eva would sit down on the ground between the two cars, and she would begin to rock back and forth. After nearly an hour of doing that, Karen and Laura suddenly emerged from the trailhead, soaking wet and laughing. Missy was not with them. After Ava had turned around and run away from the stream to go back to the cars the first time, Laura and Karen had grabbed Missy, dragged her into the water, and laid her on her stomach in the 8 inches of water. And so Missy is trying desperately to keep her head out of the water, but Laura comes around and grabs her legs and presses them into the water, and then Karen comes around and grabs the back of Missy's head and forces her head down into the water. Missy would start fighting for her life, trying to wriggle her way out of the water, and at some point she would manage to get out from under their grasp, and as soon as her head cleared the water, she took in a big breath and then let out that piercing, horrifying scream that Ava heard as she was walking back down the trail, which scared her and caused her to run away again. And after Missy let out that primal scream, Karen readjusted her grip and pressed her head back into the water. Missy would continue to squirm and fight against Karen and Laura, and periodically she'd get her head up out of the water just enough to get a little gulp of air, and then she'd choke down a bunch of water and have her head pushed down into the water again. Until finally, Missy's strength just started to ebb. And when Karen and Laura sensed that Missy was on the verge of death and she was very weak, they seized the opportunity and they leapt off of her just long enough to run over to the side of the stream where there was this big, heavy log, which investigators would later determine weighed over 100 pounds. So it weighed more than Missy, and Karen and Laura, they'd pick this log up, they'd walk back into the stream, and they dropped the log directly on the back of Missy's head, forcing it down into the water permanently. A few minutes after drowning Missy in the stream, Karen and Laura walked out of the trail, they got into their cars, Eva climbed into Laura's car, and the girls just left the parking lot and drove back home, leaving Missy in the woods. 3 days later, a group of hikers were in that forest near where Missy had been killed, and they spotted her body in the stream. When police arrived, they found cigarette butts, a beer bottle, and men's overalls lying out near where Missy was found. These items were there entirely coincidentally. They had nothing to do with what happened to Missy, but they somehow made the lie about Missy being with those two guys in their Camaro before she vanished seem more believable. Mostly because when Laura described these two guys to police, she kind of made it seem like they were bad boys or troublemakers, like the type of guys who would go off into the woods and smoke and drink for fun. And so the police just continued to chase down this two guys and a blue Camaro lead until the murder case went cold. But 3 years after Missy was murdered, Eva, who had been threatened by Karen and Laura never to say a word about what she knew, finally came forward to police and told them that Karen and Laura had killed Missy. When Karen, Laura, and Missy became teenagers, Missy really blossomed into this beautiful young woman who everybody seemed to adore. Meanwhile, Laura and Karen had the opposite experience. They felt awkward in their bodies and felt like no one really liked them. And so in time, they became very jealous of Missy, and that jealousy turned into resentment, and that resentment turned into hatred. And so in 1984, it was Karen and Laura who started that rumor about Missy sleeping with all these boys who had girlfriends. And that lie would get Missy attacked and beat up really badly. But that wasn't enough for Karen and Laura. They felt like Missy deserved worse. And so the following year, in September of 1985, Laura and Karen decided to kill Missy. Their plan began with spreading another rumor about Missy, about how she was sleeping around with boys with girlfriends, except this time the girlfriends in this rumor would be Laura and Karen. They did this knowing this rumor would start a fight between the three of them, and they knew that Missy just would not be able to be mad at her friends. She would want to make up with them. And so Karen and Laura, they start this rumor. It does cause a big blowout fight between the three of them. But then after this fight, Laura very intentionally makes up with Missy and kind of says, hey, let's make things right again. And so she pretends to be friends with Missy. And then a couple of weeks later, on the morning of October 1st, Karen would contact Missy. She would tell her how sorry she was. And she asked her, hey, do you want to get together today, all three of us, just like old times? And Missy fell right into their trap because she was so excited at the prospect of getting to spend time with her two best friends who she really did love. And so she quickly agreed to meet up with them. And so Laura and Missy, they arrive in the parking lot of Stonehurst Park, and then Karen comes flying in, and there's this huge fight, and there's this 45-minute drive up into the mountains where they reach this parking lot, and Karen and Laura are fighting with each other, and Missy has no idea what's going on, and then all of a sudden, the fighting stops. Because the fighting wasn't real. It was all rehearsed. Laura and Karen had done that in order to throw Missy off guard and to get her up into this forest up in the mountains where they could kill her. It's unclear why Laura and Karen brought Eva along, but most likely she was brought along as a decoy as well. After Missy's body was found and the police were on this mad hunt to find these two guys and the blue Camaro, Karen actually moved in to Missy's family's home. She told them she just wanted to offer support during this really difficult time, but in reality, she just wanted to keep close tabs on the investigation, and any chance she got, she wanted to make sure she threw police and Missy's family off of her and Laura's trail. And so for months, Karen slept in Missy's bed. She ate at the same dinner table where Missy would eat with Missy's family, and Karen would spend hours out in the car with Missy's mother, Irene, and other members of Missy's family driving around looking for clues about where Missy could have gone or who really was responsible for Missy's death. When the truth finally came out 3 years later that Karen and Laura had been the ones who killed Missy, Missy's family could not believe that their daughter's killer was literally living with them the whole time. Ultimately, Laura and Karen would be found guilty of killing Missy, and they would each be sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Karen Severson was paroled in December of 2011, and Laura Doyle was paroled a year later in December of 2012. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button is having a bad day, offer to make them a cup of tea. But put the milk in before the water and use Splenda instead of sugar. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. Mondays are brand new podcast exclusives, and Thursdays are remasters of our best YouTube videos. It's called the MrBallen's Podcast, and you can find it on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, basically anywhere you find podcasts, you can find this one. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen's Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen's.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen's Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Español. We also put out near daily content on Facebook and Snapchat. Both of those channels are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. I really do read the majority of my DMs. We also have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In 1998, the Barber family was living a charmed life. Michael and Elizabeth had been happily married for 20 years, and they had 3 beautiful daughters who ranged in age from 9 to 15, and they were all thriving. The family lived in a very modest, plain-looking home in Melbourne, Australia, but the second you stepped foot inside of that home, you would see it was bursting with life. The sounds of kids laughing and playing, and of Michael and Elizabeth happily chatting away filled every room. Now, the Barbers' lives were not perfect by any means. In fact, they struggled financially and lived basically paycheck to paycheck. However, they didn't let their financial struggles define them. Instead, Michael and Elizabeth put a lot of stock in another aspect of their lives that they were all undeniably rich in, and that was in creativity. Michael was a toy maker and a designer, and Elizabeth worked in children's literature. And each of the three Barber children were beginning to cultivate their own unique creative gifts. At 9 years old, Heather, who was the youngest, had developed a lovely singing voice. Ashley Rose, who was the middle child at 11 years old, had learned to play the flute. But the Barbers' oldest daughter, 15-year-old Rachel, was really the star of the family. In fact, they called her that, Rachel Star. Rachel was an extremely talented dancer. She was so graceful and stylish that even when she was just walking around, it almost looked like she was dancing. Rachel was also very beautiful, with big emerald green eyes and fair skin, and she had this effortless charisma that just drew people to her. From the outside, Rachel really did look like the kid who had everything going for her. But, like the rest of us, Rachel had her own struggles. Like she was not a natural student. No matter how hard she tried, math and science just seemed impossible to her. And Rachel had a number of acute fears that really made certain aspects of her life very challenging. She was deathly afraid of the dark, she was afraid of talking to strangers, she was afraid of navigating the public transportation system on her own, and even just the thought of going into a store by herself filled her with immense dread. As a result of having these fears, Rachel was actually very dependent on her parents. Her mother, Elizabeth, would jokingly say that Rachel was 15, going on 18, going on 12. Eventually, when Rachel's anxieties and fears, combined with her struggles with traditional schoolwork, put her into a bit of a depression, her parents decided they needed to step in and take action. They wanted their Rachel Star to be happy. They wanted to encourage her and nurture her strengths. And the thing that they knew she loved the most and was the best at was dance. So in September of 1998, Michael and Elizabeth allowed Rachel to drop out of her traditional school and transfer to a full-time dance school in Richmond, which was an inner-city suburb of Melbourne, located about 20 minutes away from the Barber's house. And once Rachel was enrolled in this new dance school, she blossomed. She made loads of new friends, she started modeling, which was something she was very proud of, and she met a boy, Manny, who she absolutely adored. But as well as things seemed to be going for Rachel at her new school, she would soon make a fateful decision that would have absolutely catastrophic effects. On Monday, March 1st of 1999, so 5 months after Rachel had transferred to this new dance school, Rachel and her father, Michael, like every other morning, left the Barber household, climbed into Michael's car, and began driving to Wattle Park, which was a train station closest to their house. From Wattle Park, Rachel would catch a train that would take her to the Richmond station, and then she would get off, she would meet up with a friend, they would have breakfast, and they would walk the rest of the way to their dance school. When Michael pulled into the parking lot at Wattle Park and parked the car, and Rachel was getting her stuff to climb out of the vehicle to head up to the train, he stopped his daughter and said, "Hey, remember, I'll be back here at 6:15 tonight to pick you up." And Rachel looked at him, she smiled and said, "Okay," and then she hopped out of the car and she pranced her way over to the station. Michael watched his daughter just long enough to see her climb the steps and disappear, at which point he put his car back in drive, he left the lot, and he headed back home. That evening, Michael returned to Wattle Park. But at 6:15 p.m., when the train came rolling into the station, Rachel was not on board. Michael assumed his daughter must have been running late and so missed the train she would always take, and so he just sat in the parking lot and waited for the next train to come into the station. And a few minutes later, when it pulled into the station, Rachel was not on that train either. And so Michael, he was starting to get worried because he's looking outside, it's getting dark, he knows his daughter hates being out in the dark, she's afraid of being alone, and he's wondering, what's going on with her, but he keeps telling himself that she's bound to show up any minute. And so Michael just sat in this parking lot and watched train after train after train come through the station, and Rachel wasn't on any of them. Now, Michael didn't have a cell phone, and neither did Rachel, so he couldn't just call her to see where she was. But finally, after a few more trains came through and none of them contained his daughter, he left the parking lot but went to his parents' house, which was much closer than his own home, and he rushed inside and he grabbed their phone and he called back to his home. And when his wife, Elizabeth, Rachel's mom, picked up the phone, he immediately asked her, "Hey, is Rachel home? Did she get a ride home from one of her friends?" And Elizabeth would tell Michael, "No, she's not here, and she hasn't called." This was the moment when Michael and Elizabeth instinctively knew something had to be wrong. Rachel was on time for everything, and if she was late, she would always call ahead or call afterwards and at least give some explanation. But to just go silent and not show up, that was not in character. And again, because it was pitch black outside and they knew she was probably alone, that was a situation they knew Rachel would never want to be in because it would have terrified her. And so Michael tells Elizabeth he's going to come home as fast as he can. They hang up. And then while Elizabeth is waiting for her husband to return, she picked the phone right back up and she dialed Manny's number. That's Rachel's boyfriend. She figured maybe Rachel was with Manny, or at the very least, maybe she checked in with Manny because most nights Rachel and Manny spoke on the phone. But when Manny picked up the phone, he would tell Elizabeth that he hasn't seen Rachel since earlier in the day, and she has not called him, which to him was odd. When Elizabeth asked Manny, what was my daughter doing when you were with her last? Manny would say, "Oh, we went out to a shopping mall near the school in Richmond, and we went to the shoe store, and Rachel actually walked up to a very particular set of shoes. They were these big platform blue chunky shoes, and she said that she was going to buy them the next day, and she was really excited about it." And Elizabeth, as she's hearing this, she knew exactly the shoes that Manny was describing, because just the day before, Rachel had taken her mom, Elizabeth, to the shoe store and pleaded with her to get those blue chunky platform shoes. But when Elizabeth had looked at the price tag, they were $100, and so they were too expensive. And so as Elizabeth is hearing Manny say that her daughter is talking about how she's going to buy these shoes the next day, Elizabeth is thinking, with what money? Rachel has no money. How could she possibly afford those shoes? And so she asked Manny, did Rachel say how she planned on affording those blue shoes? And Manny would say, actually, yeah. She told me that she had this secret job, but she wouldn't give me any more details about it. And she said that with the money from this secret job, she'd be able to buy these shoes. Manny would tell Elizabeth that Rachel really stressed that this secret job was nothing to worry about. It was nothing immoral. But as Elizabeth is listening to Manny tell her this, all her alarm bells are going off. She could not fathom any job that would require a 15-year-old girl to go out by herself at night doing something that was secret and give absolutely no information to her family. Every possibility just seemed bad. After hanging up the phone with Manny, Elizabeth began frantically calling all of Rachel's friends and acquaintances and different locations around town that she knew her daughter would frequent, but nobody had any information about where Rachel was. A little while later, Michael finally pulled into the driveway, and when he went inside, he talked to his wife briefly, but he could tell they had no new information. Their daughter was still not home. This was becoming a crisis. And so very quickly, Michael just left the house, got right back into his car, and he drove to the police station. But when he got to the police station, the police didn't really offer the response that he was hoping for. From the police's perspective, it sounded like a teenage girl has been missing for a few hours, and so in their mind, they're thinking, one, that's not an emergency yet, and two, she probably just kind of ran off. Teenagers do that, they come back the next day, it's normal. And so despite Michael's pleas to the police that no, this is different, my daughter would never do that, she would never run away, this is totally out of character, despite all those pleas, the police said, look, Michael, just go home, wait, your daughter will be home soon, and if for some reason in the next few days she does not come back home, you come back and you tell us. And so Michael, now feeling totally devastated and terrified for his daughter's safety, finally did just leave the police station and he headed back home. And then he and his wife and his two other daughters had a terrible, restless night's sleep, wondering what was going on with Rachel. And then finally, when the sun came up the next morning, Michael and Elizabeth rushed out of their bedroom and headed into the kitchen, hoping, praying that Rachel would just magically be in their house again. But when they went into the kitchen, Rachel wasn't there. She had not come home. However, pretty early on this second day of Rachel's disappearance, Michael and Elizabeth would learn something new. Manny would get in touch with Michael and Elizabeth, and he would tell them that he remembered something Rachel had said during their final conversation the day before. She had told Manny that he had nothing to worry about with regards to this secret job because it wasn't immoral, it was totally safe. And, Manny said, Rachel said there was an old female friend who was going to be there at this job site in some way participating that would keep her safe. And so Michael and Elizabeth have no idea what to make of this old female friend, but in a way it was kind of a relief because they know their daughter is basically terrified to be alone. And so at least knowing wherever she was with this old friend, that made them feel good. But the parents' positivity about this new development quickly faded when they began calling around to all of Rachel's friends, both new and old, female and otherwise, and none of them were missing. Everybody was where they were supposed to be, and nobody knew anything about what happened to Rachel. The only intel the parents got from this round of calling all of her friends was that several of her friends said that the day before, the day Rachel disappeared, they had walked with Rachel back to the train station after school. And in fact, one of the friends told Michael and Elizabeth that they offered Rachel a ride home so that she wouldn't have to ride the train back home, but Rachel had turned it down, saying her father was going to be meeting her on the other end at Wattle Park at 6:15 p.m. The Barbers didn't know what to make of this. Did Rachel believe at the time that she could go do this secret job and still be back in time to meet her father at 6:15 at Wattle Park? Or did she lie to the friend who was offering the ride and make up the story that she planned on seeing her father when in reality she planned on ditching her father and going and doing this secret job for the night? But regardless of which of these things were true, the parents just still could not understand why by now, 24 hours later, their daughter still had not called to check in. Michael and Elizabeth found themselves wondering if they really knew their Rachel Starr as well as they thought they did. Maybe she had actually run away like the police suggested. The parents were totally distraught, they were totally anxious and terrified, and so with nothing else to do, over the next several days, they just continued to go out and look everywhere and talk to everyone to try to find where their daughter was. But everything they looked into turned into a dead end. Then, finally, on Monday, March 8th, so exactly 1 week since Rachel had disappeared, Michael and Elizabeth got a new lead. A girl named Allison, who had gone to a dance class with Rachel before Rachel had transferred schools, had overheard her younger sister talking about the Rachel Barber disappearance and how nobody had seen or heard from Rachel since 5:45 p.m. the previous Monday. Allison, who had not heard about Rachel's disappearance until this very moment, knew immediately she had to go forward and talk to police because she actually saw Rachel on the night she disappeared, a full hour after her last known sighting. At 6:40 p.m. on the night Rachel disappeared, Allison was on the train car headed to Praron, which is a suburb located southeast of where Rachel lived. And when this train that Allison was on pulled into the Richmond station and the doors opened up, Allison watched as Rachel, along with this other girl who Allison didn't recognize, walked on board and then took seats right next to each other on the other end of the train away from Allison. Now, from Allison's perspective, immediately it was clear they were friends. They were laughing and joking together and just kind of in their own world. And so Allison didn't want to be rude, so she stopped staring at them, and they continued riding the train until they got to the Praron station, at which point Allison got up to leave the train. But as she did, she saw Rachel and this mystery girl. They also had stood up and they were making their way out of the door. And as they were leaving, Rachel actually would look up and see Allison and they would both smile and wave at each other. But that was it. And then Allison would watch as Rachel and her friend would leave ahead of her and they would walk down the platform. And from Allison's perspective, it seemed obvious that Rachel and this girl were friends and whatever they were going to go do, they were choosing to go do and they were going to do together. When Michael and Elizabeth heard about this sighting of their daughter on the train and this mystery girl, on the one hand, it was kind of reassuring because it meant that Rachel was with this friend, potentially the old female friend that Rachel mentioned to Manny, and so whatever she was doing, at least she was not alone. But on the other hand, it begged the question of what role did this mystery person play in wherever Rachel was now? Had Rachel and this mystery girl gone to do this secret job together and then something happened to them? Or had this mystery girl been Rachel's accomplice, and they had run off together like the police thought? Whatever the case was, the Barbers and the police at this point, who were looking much more seriously into the Barber case by now, they knew the next step was identifying this mystery girl. A couple of days later, on Thursday, March 11th, the police called in an artist to create a sketch of this mystery girl that Allison had seen on the train. Allison would describe this mystery girl as being older than Rachel, being heavier than Rachel, and very plain. That day, the police also ordered a trace on all of the phone calls going into the Barber residence on the day before she went missing, because they figured that if Rachel and this mystery girl were in cahoots on some sort of secret thing together, they likely communicated the day before. And when the phone call trace came back, there was one phone number in particular that stood out to police. There was a private phone number that called the Barber household twice on the day before Rachel disappeared. Once at 5:24 p.m., and that call lasted about 15 minutes. And then shortly after that call ended, the private number called back, and then there was another conversation that lasted about 30 minutes. It would take police another 24 hours, but eventually they would figure out who this private caller was. It was a 20-year-old woman named Caroline Robertson who very closely resembled the police sketch of the mystery girl that Allison had seen on the train. And it just so happened that Caroline Robertson lived very close to the Praron train station where Allison saw the mystery girl and Rachel get off. Additionally, Caroline was Rachel's old babysitter and was very close with the Barber family. And so it seemed very likely that Caroline was both the mystery girl on the train and the old female friend that Rachel had mentioned to Manny when she told him about this secret job. This new information was a huge relief. From Michael and Elizabeth's perspective and the police's perspective, it now seemed very likely that Rachel and Caroline had just snuck off together and were now probably hiding out at Caroline's apartment near the Praron train station. And so, believing they could put an end to this missing teenager drama that night, the police hopped in their cars and they drove over to Caroline's apartment. But when they got there at 5:25 p.m., they very quickly realized that things were not as they seemed. Police walked up to Caroline's front door and they knocked and began yelling out for Caroline and Rachel to come outside, but nobody yelled back and nobody opened the door. When they tried the handle, they found it was locked, so they got in touch with the property's real estate agent, who came out and gave them a set of spare keys, and when the police tried those keys, they found they still could not open the door because the door had been locked from the inside with a special latch. And so the police began walking around the perimeter of the building looking for another way inside. And as they're walking, one of the officers looks up and sees a second-floor window of the apartment is open, and it's open enough that clearly a person could slip inside. And so the police contacted the fire department, who showed up very quickly, and they put a ladder up against the side of the apartment that went up to that open window, and then a police officer began climbing up. And when he got up to the window and could look inside, he saw he was looking into a bedroom. And at first, it looked totally ordinary until he noticed there was a body lying face down at the foot of the bed on the ground. It was Caroline. The officer on the ladder immediately turned around and yelled for backup, and then he and other officers poured into the apartment, and before long, Caroline, who did actually still have a pulse, but she was totally unconscious and not responding, she was being rushed to the hospital. And while that was happening, the remainder of the officers who were on site, they all went into the apartment to try to find Rachel. And so as they're searching this apartment, which was totally messy, there was things everywhere, there were boxes everywhere, it almost looked like Carolyn had been packing her apartment to move, potentially, when something happened to her, causing her to fall unconscious inside of her bedroom. And so the police searched this apartment top to bottom, and they did not find Rachel. In fact, there was no trace of Rachel anywhere, except they did find a bag of clothes that looked like they were Rachel's size, not Caroline's size, but it wasn't clear if those were actually Rachel's clothes. And so the police just kind of walked around the apartment, gathering up anything that seemed suspicious, like they found rubber gloves and hair dye, they found some bank receipts and some notebooks with some strange writing in them, and they just hoped that some of this stuff might lead to Rachel. Back at the hospital, Caroline had regained consciousness, and even though she was very disoriented and seemed kind of out of it, the medical staff allowed the police to come in right away and start asking questions because they knew time was of the essence with Rachel. They had to find her. And so the officers came into Caroline's room and they sat down, and the first question they asked her was, "Do you know where Rachel Barber is?" And Caroline just stood there kind of stunned for a second and then just said, "Yes." Over the next few months, as Caroline's memory came back into focus, she would piece together one of the most unbelievable stories that police in Melbourne had ever heard. The following is a reconstruction of that story based both on Caroline's testimony and on what police were able to actually fact check. Back on Sunday, February 28th, 1999, so the day before Rachel vanished, Caroline called Rachel and offered her a job. Caroline told Rachel that she was working on this psychology study and she needed participants. However, the study was highly confidential, so if Rachel did want to be a part of it, she wouldn't be able to tell anyone what she was doing. However, the study was quite lucrative for Rachel, and it really didn't require much of Rachel. All Rachel had to do was meet Caroline the following day after school was over at the Richmond train station, and then the two of them would ride the train to Prahran. They would get off, make their way to Caroline's apartment, and there they would conduct this psychological study, and when it was over, Caroline would pay Rachel $100 and the cost of transportation. And so Rachel, she was thrilled at the idea because she wanted those beautiful blue shoes, and so she said yes. So the next day, Monday, March 1st, Rachel wrapped up school. She made her way to the Richmond train station. She connected with Caroline. They hopped on board the train. They made their way to Prahran with Allison spotting them on the train as they went. And then when they got off the train at Prahran, Caroline and Rachel would make their way to a nearby pizza shop and get a pizza and some beer. And then they would walk the rest of the way to Caroline's apartment. Once they were inside the apartment, Caroline led them upstairs to her bedroom, and then they both sat down on the floor at the foot of the bed and began eating their pizza and having some beer and just laughing and exchanging some stories. And then after their dinner was over, Caroline told Rachel it was time to start the study, and it began with a guided meditation. Sitting next to Rachel, Caroline told her to stay calm, think happy thoughts, close your eyes, and just begin to breathe in nice and slow, breathe out nice and slow, and just feel yourself breathing in and out. And so Rachel did as she was told and began breathing in and out and being very calm. And Caroline, at this point, she stood up and began kind of pacing around the room, watching Rachel periodically and reminding her to think happy thoughts and stay calm and keep just listening to herself breathe in and breathe out. And then at some point, Caroline just stopped and stood right in front of Rachel and just stared at her really intently. And at some point, Caroline was confident that the drugs she had laced in the pizza that she had given Rachel were starting to take an effect. It looked like Rachel was starting to doze off. And so at that point, Caroline walked around behind Rachel, who still had her eyes closed. She's still doing the study, and Caroline pulled out a telephone cord. She wrapped it around Rachel's neck, and she pulled it as tight as she could. Immediately, Rachel came out of her trance, and she reached up and began trying to pull the cord off of her neck. But Caroline was easily 50 pounds heavier than Rachel and easily was able to maintain control over Rachel. And so Rachel is squirming and fighting and scratching and doing everything she can to try to get this cord off, but she can't. And eventually the fight just leaves her body and she goes still. Caroline would maintain tension on that cord to ensure Rachel was dead, but then eventually she would release the tension on the cord, at which point she would drag Rachel's body into a nearby closet and she would shut the door. 2 days later, Caroline would open that closet up and she would drag Rachel's body back out of the closet with the cord still wrapped around her neck, and she would roll Rachel's body up in a carpet and then stuff her inside of a large army duffel bag that Caroline had purchased for this exact reason, for disposing Rachel's body. And then she called a taxi who came to her apartment, and she lugged Rachel's body still inside of this bag and dumped it in the taxi. And then she and Rachel's body and the taxi driver drove about an hour north to rural Kilmore, where Caroline's father had a vacation home. And there she would bury Rachel's body in a shallow grave next to one of her childhood pets. When Caroline had been rushed to the hospital because she was found unconscious in her bedroom by police, the assumption was she and probably Rachel had been attacked, and that was why Caroline was unconscious. But what really happened is Caroline was in her apartment and she saw the police show up, and it made her so stressed that it triggered a seizure, and that was why she passed out in her bedroom. When she came to in the hospital and people began asking her what happened, she would say that Rachel's death was an accident. However, months later, after investigators had gone through all of the evidence they had collected from Caroline's apartment, they discovered Rachel's death was anything but accidental. According to the notebooks they found all over Caroline's apartment, which were basically Caroline's journals, Caroline hated herself. She totally loathed her physical image and who she was, and she was obsessed with the girl she used to babysit, Rachel Barber. Rachel was this beautiful, perfect person that Caroline wished she could be. And so one day, Caroline decided she would just stop being Caroline and would literally become Rachel. And to do that, she would kill Rachel and assume her identity. The secret job, the psychology study that Caroline offered Rachel, was a very intentional trap. She knew Rachel wanted money for things like those blue shoes, and she knew Rachel would trust Caroline. Caroline was her babysitter, and so Rachel would have no problem going into Caroline's apartment alone at night to get the money. Caroline planned to murder Rachel and stage it so it looked like Rachel had run away, and then afterwards, Caroline planned to lose 45 pounds and then get a nose job so she would look more like Rachel. And then to complete her transformation, Caroline would legally change her name to Rachel Barber. In November of 2000, Caroline Robertson pleaded guilty to murdering Rachel Barber and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. In January of 2015, Caroline was released after only serving 15 of those 20 years. In the years after Rachel's death, Rachel's mother, Elizabeth, would write a book about the experience called The Perfect Victim, which would later be adapted into a major movie that starred some of Australia's biggest actors and actresses. On Wednesday, March 24th, 1999, Rachel Barber's body was once again lowered into the ground, except this time she was surrounded by friends and family and people who loved her. Over 850 people attended Rachel's funeral. They brought letters and poems and toys, which were all buried with Rachel, as were the blue shoes that Rachel so wanted that she planned to buy with the $100 Caroline had promised her. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please soak all of the like button's underpants in water and then put them in the freezer. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen's Podcast that puts out brand new exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we remaster the best audio from YouTube. That podcast is available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen's Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen's Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Espanol. We put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.